Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy festival? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy festival? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? To me. What makes this happy festival? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy festival? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your soul. Okay, here we are. No, we're not. Everything's black. Okay. Oh, and yeah. Okay. We're a day ahead of ourselves. For some reason, I was thinking this was Sunday. Wishful thinking, I guess. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and do this reading stream anyway, because why the hell not? And then it's going to be another long one, because these last few chapters are long. Finally getting into some stuff, though. But anyway, I will start my new game tomorrow night, so we'll just do that and skip the reading tomorrow night, put us back on schedule. All right. So, Chapter 10 of Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals. The Magic Landscape. When the Rennes-le-Château village church was being repaired around 1891, 6 years after Saunier's appointment, a workman found 4 wooden cylinders containing rolls of paper inside a square Visigothic pillar that held up the altar stone. 2 of the papers proved to be genealogies of local families, allegedly linking them with the Merovingians, a dynasty of kings that had ruled France less than successfully from the 5th to the 8th centuries AD. The other 2 were Latin texts from the New Testament, but written without spaces between the words. They were fairly obviously in code. In fact, the code of the shorter text was so straightforward that Henry Lincoln saw it at a glance as he looked at the reproduction in a book called Le Trésor Maudit, the Accursed Treasure, by a journalist called Gerard de Sade. Some letters were raised above the others, and then these were written down consecutively. They read, A. Dagobert II, and this is all in French, so Roi Sion et ce trésor il est la mort. I haven't done taken French since junior high, so I know I butchered that. I would have butchered it just as bad back then. So this treasure belongs to King Dagobert II and to Sion or Sion, and he is there dead. Sion was Jerusalem, and the last phrase could also mean, and it is death. Dagobert was a 7th century French king of the Merovingian dynasty. The author of these parchments was probably a predecessor of Saunier named Antoine Bigot, who had been cure, I guess that's supposed to be. It's cure, C-U-R-E, but had been cure of Rennes-le-Château at the time of the French Revolution. Anyway, Saunier took the parchments to his bishop, who was intrigued enough to send him to Paris to consult with various scholars. There he went along to the church of Saint Sulpice and talked with its director, the Abbé Biel. He also met Biel's nephew, a young trainee priest named Émile Hoffet. Hoffet was involved in a circle of occultists who flourished in Paris in the 1890s, and some of whom J.K. Huysmans, it's Huysmans, I guess that's Huysmans, portrays in his quote-unquote Satanist novel, Le Bas.
Hoffet introduced Saunier to a circle of writers and artists that included the poet Mallarme, the dramatist Maeterlinck, and the composer Debussy. Saunier also, probably through Debussy, met the famous soprano Emma Calvé and probably became her lover. Saunier was far from an ascetic. Before leaving Paris, Saunier visited the Louvre and bought reproductions of 3 paintings, including Poisson's Les Bergers d'Arcadie, the Shepherds of Arcadia, which showed 3 shepherds and a shepherdess standing in front of a tomb on which are carved the words Et in Arcadia ego, usually translated I, death, am also in Arcadia. The original title of the painting was Happiness Subdued by Death. Back in Rennes-le-Château 3 weeks later, Saunier hired workmen to raise a stone slab set in the floor in front of the altar. It dated from around the time of Dagobert II, who had lived in Rennes-le-Château in the far-off days when it was a flourishing town. They discovered 2 skeletons and a quote-unquote pot of worthless medallions. Saunier sent his helpers away and spent the evening in the church alone. When Saunier committed an odd piece of vandalism on a grave in the churchyard, that of a distinguished lady named Marie de Blanchefort, and obliterated its 2 inscriptions. But he was unaware that the inscriptions had already been published in a little book by a local antiquary. One comments the words Et in Arcadia ego in a mixture of Greek and Latin letters on either side of the slab. The other is curious in that it contains 4 unexplained lower-case letters, 3 E's and 2 P's, and 4 capitals, TMRO. From the small letters, only one word can be formed, épée, sword, while from the capitals, the only word that emerges is mort, death. Épée proved to be the key word to decipher the second parchment Saunier had found in the column. And before we go on, this looks like the inscription. Says the inscriptions on the tombstone of Marie de Blanchefort. Okay. So, yeah, I will show you that. As always, there we go. And I'll try to get this other column of, there we go. So that's the whole thing. And suddenly Saunier was rich. He built a public road to replace the dirt road to the village, and a water tower, and he built himself a villa with a garden, and a Gothic tower to house his library. Distinguished visitors came regularly, including Emma Calvé and the Austrian Archduke Johann von Habsburg, cousin of the Emperor Franz Joseph. His many guests were superbly fed and wined by his young peasant housekeeper, Marie Denarno. He also restored and redecorated the village church, but in appalling taste. Its glaring colors recall Disneyland. Inside the door, the visitor encounters a crouching, club-footed devil. This, apparently, is Asmodeus, the legendary guardian of Solomon's treasure, and at the foot of a hill on which Christ is succoring the afflicted lies an incongruous money bag. The layout of the quotation, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden," also has an anomaly. The first 2 letters of accable, burdened, are smaller than the rest of the word, and a faint line links them to the last letter of the previous word, the S of été. So we read sacable, which means which sounds like sacable, bag of corn. Corn is French slang for gold. Moreover, the original quotation does not say accablé, but affligé, afflicted. Saunier has changed it so he can get in the pun about the bag of gold. The Stations of the Cross are also full of incomprehensible oddities, like a mysterious figure who is turning his back on Pontius Pilate and holding up a golden egg. In Station 2, a young man picking up a stick is totally irrelevant. So is a soldier holding up his shield against the sky in Station 6. Excuse me. The devil is half sitting on a throne carved out of a rock that the villagers would all recognize as a nearby rock known as the Devil's Armchair. They would also know that beside the rock there is a spring known as the Spring of the Circle. The devil seems to be underlining the name by joining his right thumb and index finger to form a circle. Saunier is obviously playing games or trying to tell us something. The bishop who came to bless the church was obviously disturbed and puzzled by it and never came again, but at least he was friendly. A new bishop was openly hostile, and when Saunier refused to divulge the source of his wealth, saying merely that it was from a wealthy penitent who insisted on anonymity, the bishop ordered his transfer to another parish. Saunier refused to be transferred, and another priest was appointed in his place. Oddly enough, when the bishop took his complaint to Rome, the Pope found in Saunier's favor. In 1905, the French government, which was anti-clerical, began to make his life uncomfortable by accusing him of being an Austrian spy. It seemed that part of his regular income came from Austria. In 1917, Saunier died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 65. The priest who attended his deathbed is said to have been so shocked at his final confession that he refused to administer extreme unction. His housekeeper lived on in the villa and died in 1953. She had sold the villa in 1946 and told its purchaser that one day she would tell him a secret that would make him rich and powerful, but a stroke left her speechless. This was the remarkable story Henry Lincoln read in Gerard de Cide's book. There were obviously many questions. Had Saunier found a treasure, or had he learned some secret that led certain wealthy patrons to wish to silence him with large sums of money? Was he a blackmailer, or simply a member of a small group who shared some closely guarded secret? There was yet another possibility, that the treasure might have been that of the Templars, concealed to keep it out of the hands of Philip the Fair. Not far from Le Chateau is the Chateau of Bézu, whose owner was the Seigneur de Goth, who escaped from the Templar fleet from La Rochelle. On his return to London, Lincoln succeeded in interesting a friend at the BBC in the story, and the two of them went to René Le Chateau. Gerard de Cide had agreed to act as a consultant on the program and was able to provide the key to decoding the second mystery parchment. It was incredibly complex code which involved a technique known to cipher experts as the Vigenère process. I don't know. The alphabet is written 26 times, the first beginning with A, the second with B, the third with C, and so on. The key word mort épée is placed over the parchment, and the letters are transformed using the Vigenère table. The noble Mary de Blanchefort text, which Saunier had tried to destroy, is then used as another key word. And finally, the letters are placed on a chessboard, and a series of moves produces a message, which may be translated shepherdess to shepherdess no temptation, to which Poisson and Teniers holds the key piece 681, with the crosses and this horse of God I reach this demon guardian at midday blue apples. Okay, that still doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but this presumably is what had led Saunier to his fortune, although it is hard to see how. In his subsequent television program, The Priest, the Painter, and the Devil, Lincoln has a suggestion. In the original parchment, he had noticed certain letters that were smaller than the others. Those spelt out the words Rex Mundi, King of the Earth. This led him to suppose that the Cathars, a sect of medieval heretics who were bloodily suppressed by the church, played some part in the story. Like other heretical sects, such as the Bogomils and the Albigensians and the Waldenses, the Cathars believed that everything to do with the spirit is good and everything to do with matter is evil, a belief also known as Manichaeism, and that therefore this world was not created by God but by the devil. In 1244, the Cathars of the Languedoc were virtually wiped out after a siege of their stronghold on top of a mountain called Montsegur, and were burned alive at the foot of the mountain. But 3 months before their surrender, 2 men escaped carrying the quote-unquote treasure of the Cathars and slipped through the lines of the besiegers. No one knows the nature of this treasure, but it is clear that 2 men could not have carried much in the way of gold and jewels. So Saunier's wealth cannot have been Cathar treasure unless he found it elsewhere. Which means we can probably dismiss the Cathars as a solution to this mystery. It is true that they may be described as Gnostics, from the Greek gnosis meaning knowledge, and that the writers of the so-called Hermetic books, of which the most famous is the Emerald Tablets of Hermes Trismegistus, are also known as Gnostics. But these early Gnostics do not regard matter as evil. The Essenes seem to have belonged to this latter group, but there is no connection between Essene Gnosticism and that of the Cathars, so we shall drop the Cathars from the story. By the way, I have the Emerald Tablets of Hermes Trismegistus in one form or another. I think there are multiple translations of it, and I think I have at least 1 or 2. Anyway, in electronic format, of course. So we may come to that someday. The Mary inscriptions ends with the letters P.S. This, Lincoln learned, could be could stand for Priory of Sion, Sion meaning Jerusalem. And in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, Lincoln found that a number of pamphlets and documents had been deposited since 1956, many written under pseudonyms like Anthony the Hermit. One of these documents spoke about a secret order called the Priory of Sion, and gave a list of its grand masters, which included the alchemist Nicholas Flamel, reputed to have made gold, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Claude Debussy, and more recently, Jean Cocteau. Saunier, we recall, had met Debussy on the trip to Paris. And according to these documents, collectively known as the Secret Dossier, the Priory of Sion was the inner hierarchy of the Knights Templar. The dossier claimed that the priory had continued to exist even after the Templars were destroyed. And of course, if you saw the movie or read the book, The Da Vinci Code, you know that the Priory of Sion played a huge part in that fictional story, or, well, it's what's supposed to be a fictional story, but who knows? There were several books we'll go through in this series that kind of say it's not, but Who knows? This suggested to Henry Lincoln that Saunier had not found a treasure, but that his wealth came from holding an important position in the Priory of Sion. In fact, many known facts point to this conclusion. According to Henry Buthian, who owned the hotel that was once Saunier's Villa Bethany, Saunier was often short of cash and failed to pay 5,000 francs that he owed the makers of some expensive furniture he ordered for the villa. He certainly died penniless, but that may have been because he simply allowed large sums of money to be paid direct to his housekeeper, Mary Denardeau. Still, a man with a hidden treasure does not run short of cash, even if he banks it. Much of Saunier's cash seems to have come from Austria, which is why the French government suspected him of spying. Eventually, Lincoln's television program got made and was broadcast in 1972 under the title The Lost Treasure of Jerusalem. But by now, so much material had come to light that it was clear that a second program was going to be required. Perhaps the most intriguing hint of all came soon after the program was transmitted. A retired Church of England vicar wrote to tell Lincoln that the treasure was not gold or jewels, but a document proving that Jesus was not crucified in 33 AD, but had still been alive in AD 45. Lincoln went to see him. The clergyman obviously wished he had kept his mouth shut, but he finally admitted that this information had come from an Anglican scholar named Canon Alfred Lilly. And Lincoln's heart must have leapt as he heard this. Lilly had maintained close contact with scholars based at St. Sulpice and had known Emile Hoffet, who had introduced Saunier to Debussy. This obviously raised a fascinating possibility. If Debussy was indeed a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, could he have shared the belief that Jesus did not die on the cross? And was that Saunier's secret, which so shocked the priest who listened to his final confession? It certainly began to look more and more as if this was the answer. We may recall that when Saunier left Paris, he purchased some copies of paintings from the Louvre, among them Les Bergers d'Arcadie, the Shepherds of Arcadia, which shows three shepherds and a shepherdess standing by a tomb wearing the words Et in Arcadia ego. While they were filming the first program, Deseed told Lincoln that the actual tomb used in the painting had been discovered at Arques, not far from Rennes-le-Château, and in fact the tomb, although it had no Latin inscription, was otherwise identical even to the stone on which the shepherd is resting his foot in the painting. So it's pretty dark, but you might be able to see Nicolas Poisson's The Shepherds of Arcadia. There we go. And he does have his foot up on a stone. Anyway. Nicolas Poisson, 1594 to 1665, was one of the most distinguished painters of his time. Although born in Normandy, it was in Rome that he won fame and spent most of his life. For a short time, he had served Louis XIII and Richelieu, I don't know, Richelieu. Poisson's The Shepherds of Arcadia came into the possession of Louis XIV after his agents had been trying with great tenacity to lay their hands on it for some time. Yet when the king finally became its owner, he kept it locked away in his private chambers. Rumor has it that he was afraid that it might reveal some secret if it was displayed more publicly. Yet the painting itself seems to offer no clues as to why the king wanted it so badly, or why he then kept it from the eyes of the world. What we do know, however, is that in 1656 the king's Minister of Finance, Nicolas Fouquet, uh, sent his younger brother Louis, to Rome to see Poisson, and that Louis then wrote to Nicholas, quote, "He and I have planned certain things of which in a little while I shall be able to inform you fully, things which will give you, through Monsieur Poisson, advantages which kings would have great difficulty in obtaining from him, and which, according to what he says, no one in the world will ever retrieve in centuries to come, and furthermore it would be achieved without much expense, and could even turn to profit. And they are matters so difficult to inquire into that nothing on earth at the present time could bring a greater fortune, nor perhaps ever its equal." End quote. What can he be talking about? Quote, "Nothing on earth could ever bring a greater fortune," unquote, sounds like a treasure, except that he also says it could, quote unquote, even turn to profit, which suggests that he means something else after all. What is certain is that the king, who was only 5 years old when he came to the throne, nursed an increasing dislike of his brilliant and ambitious finance minister. Fouquet became immensely wealthy, and according to his assistant Colbert, um, he managed this by cooking the books every afternoon. In 1661, Louis had Fouquet arrested, and he was eventually imprisoned. Some historians have suggested that he was the famous Man in the Iron Mask, but he died 23 years before the mysterious prisoner. It is possible that when Fouquet sent his brother Louis to Poisson, it was with treasonous intent. Is it possible? Indeed, it is, and that possible treason leads us to another encounter with the Priory of Sion. The Merovingian king Dagobert II, born in AD 651, was kidnapped as a child and taken to Ireland, while a usurping major domo took his place. But he returned to France, in fact to René le Chateau, now married to a Visigothic princess called Giselle. He reclaimed the throne, but was murdered in 679 as he lay asleep under a tree. The church certainly played some part in the assassination, but his major domo, Pepin the Fat, was also involved. Pepin was the grandfather of the famous warrior Charles Martel, who turned back the Muslim invasion of France at the Battle of Poitiers, and saved Europe from becoming Muslim. His son, Pepin the Short, seized the throne and inaugurated the Carolingian dynasty, whose most famous member was his son, the great Charlemagne. The descendants of Dagobert were understandably resentful about being deprived of the throne, and there was always a movement in favor of their restoration, rather like the Jacobites in England. Like the Jacobites, they were a lost cause, but one Merovingian descendant achieved a fame that rivaled that of Charles Martel or Charlemagne. He was Godfrey de Bouillon, 1058 to 1100, Duke of Lorraine, the man who led the First Crusade and recaptured Jerusalem, the knight who became the first king of Jerusalem. There can also be little doubt that he was the founder or one of the founders of another dynasty, the Priory of Sion, or as it was first known, the Order of Our Lady of Sion. And soon after the capture of Jerusalem, an abbey of Sion was built on the Temple Mount, and its occupants were known as the Order of Our Lady of Sion. According to the secret dossier, the order was founded in 1090, 9 years before the fall of Jerusalem. 5 of the 9 original Templars were members, so it was probable that the Templar order sprang out of the Order of Sion. Lincoln cites evidence to show that the two orders soon grew apart. It seems that the fabulous power and wealth of the Templars made them headstrong like unruly children, and matters came to a head in 1187 when a Templar named Gerard de Ridefort led the knights into a rash encounter with the Saracens and lost Jerusalem, this time forever. Oh, hey, I was so busy reading. Hey, Super Nambro, how you doing? I'm a day ahead on the reading, but because I mixed up my schedule. But hey, here we are. Uh, Glad to have you. Thanks for coming in. Sorry I didn't notice the chat earlier. I was so absorbed in the book. Um, at this point, it seems the Order of Sion lost patience with the Templars and broke with them. The order now changed its name to the Priory of Sion. One of the major aims of the priory was to restore the Merovingians to the throne of France. When the Templars were destroyed in 1307, the priory continued to exist, no doubt because it was such a well-kept secret. So this could well explain why Louis XIV was anxious to get rid of his minister Fouquet and to get his hands on Poisson's painting. If the quote-unquote secret that kings could not draw from him was the secret of the Priory of Sion, Louis may well have been worried. His uncle Gaston d'Orléans had been married to the Duke of Lorraine's sister, and there had been an attempt to depose Gaston's elder brother, Louis XIII, in favor of Gaston, in which case the Merovingian line would once again have flowed in the veins of the kings of France. The attempt failed, but since Louis XIII was childless, it looked very much as if Gaston would nevertheless inherit the throne. Then, to everyone's amazement, Louis XIII produced a son. At least his wife Anne of Austria did. Were many people who believed that the Cardinal Richelieu, I don't know how to pronounce that, was the true father, or perhaps that he had employed a stud. Some suggest that his stud was Richelieu's captain of musketeers, Francois Daguerre, I guess, and that it was Daguerre who thus frustrated the designs of the Merovingians and the Priory of Sion to wrest back the throne. Francois Daguerre had two sons named Louis and Eustache. 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 Looks like mustache, but Eustache. um, Many people commented on the resemblance between the brothers and Louis XIV. This is understandable if, in fact, Daguerre's sons were the king's half-brothers. But Eustache was the ne'er-do-well, always in trouble. Both Louis Daguerre and Eustache were eventually arrested. Louis for an affair of the heart, Eustache for general hell-raising. But Louis was released and continued to rise in the world. Eustache disappeared and may well have been the man in the iron mask. It was actually a velvet mask, and if indeed Eustache was the mystery prisoner, he may have been forced to wear it because of his resemblance to the king. His offense may have been to try and blackmail the king, quote unquote, release my brother or else. Or he may have got involved with the Priory of Sion and the Merovingians, who would have been delighted to learn that Louis XIV had no right to be on the throne because he was illegitimate. We may mention in passing that the Habsburgs were also members of the House of Lorraine, and therefore prime candidates for membership of the Priory of Sion, and we may recall that one of Saunier's guests was Johann von Habsburg, and that Saunier received money from Austria. It sounds as if Saunier's visit to St. Sulpice introduced him to people who were willing to share their secret and give him generous financial support as the present incumbent of Dagobert's ancient stronghold. But this complex and fascinating story has another amazing twist. We may have seen that Lincoln learned from a retired clergyman that the real treasure was the knowledge that Jesus did not die on the cross, and this knowledge came from St. Sulpice. If St. Sulpice was the parish headquarters of the Priory of Sion, then it may well be that Saunier's secret, the secret that shocked the priest who attended his deathbed, was that Jesus had not died on the cross, and that therefore the Christian church had been built on foundations of sand, since it was based on the notion that Jesus died on the cross to save man from the burden of original sin. It really does look like it's a bait and switch. I'm enjoying it. I just wish it had something to do with this kingdom of Neanderthals. But, hey, it is what it is. It's an enjoyable book. Not at all what I expected. When Lincoln was working on the BBC program The Shadows of the Templars, he was suddenly struck by a startling thought. He and two researchers, Richard Ley and Michael Bejant, were joking about a legend that the mother of King Merovech, the founder of the Merovingian line, had been impregnated by a sea creature, and one of them quipped that the story sounded fishy. Suddenly Lincoln and Ley looked at one another as they were seized with the same suspicion. Fish, the symbol of Christianity, could the legend mean that the lady had been impregnated by a symbol of Christianity, a direct descendant of Jesus? The Merovingians' kings claimed that they reigned by right of blood, royal blood, not by being anointed by the church. Was the bloodline they were so proud of that of Jesus himself? Then who was Jesus' wife? In the village of Le Sainte Marie de la Mer, there is a yearly ceremony held to celebrate the arrival of Mary Magdalene in France, bearing the true cross and the Holy Grail. The church in Rennes-le-Château is dedicated to her and has two statues of her carrying the cross and the Grail. Saunier built a library called the Tour Magdala, the Magdalene Tower. Mystics of the Middle Ages identified her with the planet Venus, the goddess of love. In December 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, an interesting discovery threw new light on Mary Magdalene. Two peasants who were digging for fertilizer in a graveyard at the foot of a cliff came upon a jar buried at the base of a boulder, which contained a number of parchments written in Coptic, ancient Egyptian written with Greek letters. And the Coptic church still exists in Egypt. There's a monastery and everything. They are very persecuted by the Muslims. Just as in case you didn't know. These proved to be known Christian Gospels, many contemporary with those of the New Testament. They had titles like the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, and most significantly, the Gospel of Mary. This is not the Virgin Mary, but Mary Magdalene. Mary is seen encouraging the disciples after the resurrection of Jesus, and is quite obviously the most important among them. The Gospel of Philip refers to Mary as Jesus' companion, and the original Greek word means consort. And just as an aside, I also do have the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I have a translation of that. So that will be a book that comes up later on in this series. The notion that Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus is not so surprising. All Jewish rabbis and preachers were not only permitted, but expected to marry. It's an argument I've made forever. In the New Testament, Mary is referred to only once. She is a reformed prostitute who dries Jesus' feet with her hair. The Nag Hammadi Gospels indicated that she was, like Jesus, a descendant of a royal line, the house of Benjamin. Jesus, of course, was of the house of David. See, and I've heard people actually argue that there's no proof that that person that dried his feet with her hair was Mary Magdalene. So a lot of people argue she doesn't show up in the New Testament in any way. That it's actually just church tradition that she was a reformed prostitute. um, partly because of decisions made at the Council of Nicaea in, what was that, 425 or whatever it was, where they decided on what books would be included in the Bible. They also cut out anything that made Jesus look like a normal human man with a wife and possibly children, because they wanted him to appear more divine. That's just what I've heard and read. When the New Testament was first assembled by bishops who had been appointed by Constantine, all reference to Mary as Jesus' wife was censored, and she was reduced to a former reformed prostitute. The Gospels of Mary, Philip, Thomas, and others were collected and destroyed. But someone took care that the Nag Hammadi Gospels survived in a clay urn, and they indicate that Mary was married to Jesus. In Leonardo's painting The Last Supper, she is sitting at the right hand of Jesus. The painting had also been censored, and Mary Magdalene changed to a man. But when it was cleaned in 1954, the disciple on Jesus' right hand was seen to be a woman. Leonardo, of course, is listed in the secret dossier as one of the Grand Masters of the Priory. And St. Peter, who hated her, as the Nag Hammadi Gospels make clear, holds out his hand in a threatening gesture, and a disembodied hand holding a dagger also threatens her. It was all this that led Lincoln and Lay to speculate that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had come to France and founded the bloodline of the Merovingians. There are dozens of legends of Mary, from Marseille to Rennes-le-Château, where the church is dedicated to her. Perhaps the tomb that Poussin painted was, in fact, the tomb of Jesus. It was this extraordinary speculation, and Lincoln insists that it is merely a speculation, that made The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail an instant bestseller. I also have that book. By now, Lincoln had learned that the detective work of a BBC researcher that the most important living member of the Priory of Sion was a man named Pierre Plantard. Plantard was indeed the name of the noble family that was of the Merovingian line. A meeting was arranged, and Lincoln invited Plantard to view the second Rennes-le-Château film, The Priest, the Painter, and the Devil. He proved to be a kindly and courteous elderly gentleman born in 1920, and a group of his followers were present. The closest seemed to be a marquis named Philip de Chérisay. Lincoln was to learn that de Chérisay was responsible for much of the secret dossier deposited in the Louvre. Sitting behind them, Lincoln was pleased to observe that they became suddenly attentive when the film showed an image of one of the parchments in which Lincoln had detected the form of a pentagram. Lincoln also noticed something odd about the geometry of Poussin's Shepherds of Arcadia. Looking for the secret that seemed to have alarmed Louis XIV, he noticed that the staff of the shepherd on the right is neatly cut in two by the shepherd's arm, and the distance from the top of the staff to the shepherd's pointed finger was precisely the same half measure. He soon noticed other half measures throughout the painting. The picture had obviously been designed geometrically. Lincoln showed the painting to Professor Christopher Cornford of the Royal College of Art, and Cornford found something even more fascinating. The structure of the painting was based on the geometrical proportion known as the golden section, and called by the Greek letter phi. Not pi, phi. At first sight, this sounds like a rather boring definition from a school geometry book. In fact, it is a notion of such overwhelming and profound importance that it would be easy to devote a whole book to it. Basically, it is a way of dividing a line so that the proportion of the short part to the long part is the same as the proportion of the long part to the whole line, as in the following figure. And this is the golden section ratios. Okay? That sounds like a conundrum from one of the puzzle books you buy to keep the children quiet on the train. Then why is it so important? Because of some odd reason, because for some odd reason, nature uses it all the time. Your body is an example. With your navel acting as the division between the two parts, it can be found in the spirals of leaf arrangements, petals around the edge of a flower, leaves around a stem, pine cones, seeds in a sunflower head, seashells, even in the arms of spiral nebula. Artists also discovered it at a fairly early stage because this way of dividing a picture is oddly pleasing to the eye, in exactly the same way that musical harmonies are pleasant to the ear. Why is nature so fond of it? Because it is the best way of minimizing wasted space. Obviously, there is something very important about this simple-looking fraction. It is, in fact, 0.618034, etc., 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 going on forever as some decimals do. Another form of phi is 1.618. If you wish to extend a line a phi distance, you simply multiply it by 1.618. We must mention one more piece of mathematics before we can get back to the mystery of René Le Chateau. This is a sequence of numbers invented by the mathematician Fibonacci, in which each number is the sum of the preceding two numbers. So if you begin with 0, then the next number is obviously 1, and 0 plus 1 equals 0. 1 equals 1, and that 1 plus the previous 1 equals 2, and that 2 plus the preceding 1 equals 3, and so on. And the sequence is 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, and so on. The Fibonacci sequence. And now another curious fact. If you take any two Fibonacci numbers and divide each one by the one after it, the answer gets closer and closer to the golden number, 0.618034. The bigger the numbers concerned. For example, 2 divided by 3 is 0.6666, but 34 divided by 55 is 0.6182. Yet no matter how big the numbers become, even billions or trillions, the number never quite reaches the golden number. It is these Fibonacci numbers that can be found in pine cones, nautilus shells, and spiral nebula. Why God decided to choose such an odd ratio is anybody's guess, but it is also worth mentioning that the Fibonacci spiral can be derived from a pentacle. If one side of its inner pentagram is placed at right angles to the side of the legs, the Fibonacci spiral can be started from the end of the shorter line. Okay, and he illustrates this. So, the Fibonacci spiral. Oop. Come on, there we go. And there are more illustrations coming up. It seems that God also had some preference for pentagrams. It is worth adding that according to Herodotus, in a passage we need to amend slightly to make any sense of what is obviously a copyist's error, the golden section can also be found in the area of each side of the Great Pyramid. When Cornford reported to Henry Lincoln on the Shepherds of Arcadia, he explained that he began by looking for one of two systems in constant use by classical painters. One is a number system based on Plato's Timaeus, a dialogue about the creation of the universe, which also includes stuff about Atlantis, which became highly influential in the Renaissance, but the other is a far older system, a geometry based on the golden section. Cornford expected to find the Timaeus system in Poisson's painting because the golden section system was then regarded as extremely old-fashioned. In fact, he did find traces of this system. But the basic system used in the Shepherds of Arcadia is the golden section. The painting is also full of pentagonal geometry. Consider the following. There's an illustration, but I'm going to read what's in between here first. There are two illustrations. The ratio of all its 5 sides, for example, AB, to its chords, like AC, is the ratio 1 to 1.618, or phi. And when Cornford looked more closely, he could draw a pentagram that went outside the painting. And then the second illustration is pentagram extending beyond the parameters of the Shepherds of Arcadia. So, first one, this is what he was referring to. A to B and, what was that? A to C. And then the second one, he's showing the painting is the gray box, and that's the pentagram extending beyond it. Okay, moving on. In short, the pentacle was encoded into Poisson's painting, and that led Cornford to make an interesting suggestion. Could the phrase, Poisson holds the key, be anything to do with the landscape around Rennes-le-Château, which is where Saunier searched for the treasure? This comment led Lincoln to one of the most important discoveries. When he looked at an ordnance survey map of the Rennes-le-Château region, one thing was immediately obvious, that 3 of its key sites, Rennes-le-Château, the Templar Château of Bézu, and the Blanchefort Château, were 3 points of a triangle, and all were on hilltops. When Lincoln drew the triangle on his map and proceeded to measure its lines he received a surprise. It was a precise isosceles triangle, that is, with 2 sides exactly equal. With Bézu at the apex of the triangle, the lines from Bézu to Blanchefort and from Bézu to Rennes-le-Château were equal. This could not be an accident. At some remote point in time, someone had observed that the 3 hilltops made a precise triangle, and in due course they had been chosen as part of the secret pattern. Now Lincoln found himself wondering if by any remote chance there were 2 more hilltops which would form the rest of a pentagram. Of course, he felt that would be asking too much. Yet when he studied the map, he was staggered to find that there were indeed 2 such hilltops, in precisely the right places. The eastern one was called La Soulaine, and the western one Serre de Lozette, and when the 5 hilltops were joined up, they formed an exact pentacle. That makes me wonder if they're not artificial hilltops, maybe. But anyway. It was obviously an amazing natural freak, but there was one more surprise to come. When Lincoln looked for the center of the map, he found that it was marked by another hill called La Pique. Admittedly, although the summit of La Pique looked on the map like the dead center, it was actually 250 yards to the southeast of center. But that was to be expected. After all, this was not a man-made landscape. It was incredible enough that La Pique fell at the center of the pentacle. So this was the basic secret of Rennes-le-Château, that it was part of a sacred landscape. Perhaps this is why Rennes-le-Château was chosen by Dagobert as his home, and why his son Sigisbert fled there after his father's murder. The royal blood of the Merovingians was associated with a magic landscape. I was dubious until I read Lincoln's Key to the Sacred Pattern and realized that this was a natural magic landscape, as Henry Lincoln recognized. Oddly enough, Monsieur Plantard refused to confirm Lincoln's insight, although it was obvious that he and Cherisy were startled that Lincoln had discovered the pentagonal geometry in the Saunier parchments, Plantard would simply not enlarge. On the contrary, when Lincoln asked him about the hidden codes in the parchments, Plantard made the incredible remark that the parchments were confections, concocted by his friend Cherisy. For what purpose? For a 10-minute television film made some years previously? Quite rightly, Lincoln refused to swallow this. The incredible complexity of the code left no doubt that it had taken a very long time and a great deal of skill to prepare. So why did Plantard try to throw dust in his eyes? For there seems little doubt that it was Plantard's original aim, and that of the Priory, to bring this mystery to public attention. The aim, presumably, to place the Merovingian descendants in a good position if France should get tired of being a republic. Desailles originally told Lincoln, quote, "We hoped it might interest someone like you," end quote. Yet now Lincoln had got his teeth into the subject and had discovered the pentagonal geometry. Plantard seemed to feel he had been a little too successful and wanted to backtrack. In 1991, Lincoln made another important discovery. He had been contacted by a Danish television producer who had been born on the island of Bornholm. Erling Haagensen had become fascinated by Bornholm's 15 churches, which dated from the 13th century, the time of the Knights Templar, and the fact that they often seemed to be associated with ancient megaliths. In fact, some megaliths were actually built into the church walls. Now Lincoln had been toying with the idea that perhaps some of René Le Chateau's pattern had been laid out in megalithic times, and when Haagensen told him that the geometry he had identified on Bornholm was pentacular, Lincoln became Lincoln became convinced that they were each uncovering a different portion of the same mystery. Moreover, Haagensen found that the English mile present in the Bornholm geometry, for example, if what? Moreover, Haagensen found the English mile present in the Bornholm geometry. For example, if Haagensen's geometry was correct, the distance between two of the churches, Ibsker and Povsker, should be exactly 7 miles, and it was. Why miles? In a chapter called The Measure, Lincoln lays out some curious but highly convincing facts. The French meter, which came into use in 1791, was 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator. Lincoln shows that an Old English measure called the rod, pole, or perch, which is 320th of a mile, is also a precise measure of the Earth's surface. One pole, 198 inches, multiplied by itself squared, i.e. squared, is a kilometer, 39,204 inches. When this ancient pole, 198 inches, is multiplied by 1.618, the golden section, the result is 320, the number of poles in 1 mile. So there is a mathematical connection between the British pole and the kilometer, and between the pole multiplied by the golden section and the mile. Lincoln also cites Berriman's Historical Metrology, the book that mentions that the Greeks stayed proves the Greeks knew the exact size of the earth. Berriman asks, quote, "Was the earth measured in remote antiquity?" End quote, and sets out to demonstrate that it was, bringing in ancient Egypt, Babylon, Sumer, China, Persia, and many other cultures. He argues that ancient weights and measures are derived from measuring the earth, which of course means in turn that ancient people had already measured the earth. The book must have struck Berriman's contemporaries as hopelessly eccentric. He says that one measure was a certain fraction of the earth's circumference, that a measure of land area, the acre, was based on a decimal fraction of the square of the Earth's radius, and that certain weights were based on the density of water and of gold. It sounds as if Berriman is positing the existence of some ancient civilization which vanished without a trace except for these ancient measures. This, of course, is consistent with Hapgood's comment that history does not necessarily proceed steadily in a forward direction. It might pause or even backtrack. This, in turn, was the basis of his assertion that a civilization with high levels of science existed 100,000 years ago. Lincoln, finally, we're getting to something, because this is not just Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals. The rest of the title is 100,000 Years of Lost History. So we're maybe finally bringing in a little bit to tie in the title, at least, even if it is still a bait and switch kind of book. Lincoln came upon a Norwegian named Harold Bolke, probably more like Bulke, who had made some remarkable discoveries about Norwegian distances. Norway was pagan until 1,000 years ago, and with the coming of Christianity, scattered trading posts disappeared and gave way to larger centers, which became cities. And Bulke's God, I totally lost it. And Bulke's researches seem to establish that the new cities, Oslo, Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, Hamar, Tønsberg, were placed in what looked like quite arbitrarily chosen spots. For example, Oslo in what was simply a backwater. No one has the slightest idea why Stavanger was chosen as a cathedral town, but distances seem chosen for some mathematical reason. Oslo to Stavanger, 190 miles. Oslo to Bergen, 190 miles. Tønsberg to Stavanger, 170 miles. Tønsberg to Halsnøy, 170 miles, and so on. Moreover, the position of the old monasteries again shows a pentagonal geometry. It looks as if the church was using some secret geometrical knowledge in creating the new Christian Norway. Lincoln also identified a church measure of 188 meters and appealed in a French magazine for examples of it, as well as of pentagonal geodesics. A mathematics teacher named Patricia Hawkins, who lived in France, was able to find no less than 162 church measures, linking churches, hilltops, and those roadside crucifixes called Calvaries in the Quimper area of Brittany. Quimper? I don't know. Lincoln begins the last chapter of Key to the Sacred Pattern, quote, "We are confronting a mystery. The structured landscape of Rennes-le-Château and its association with the English mile, as well as the mile's apparent link with the dimensions of the earth, are easily demonstrated with a multitude of confirming instances. The measure and the geometry are evident. The patterns are repeatable. The designs are meaningful. All this was created in a remote past upon which the phenomenon is shedding a new light." End quote. And he goes on to plead for historians and archaeologists to turn their attention to the evidence. Now, by patterns, Lincoln is not simply talking about the pentacle of mountains or the circle of churches. His own study of the Rennes-le-Château area revealed many patterns that could only have been created by deliberate intent. The quote-unquote holy place of his title is, quote, "the natural pentagon pentagon of mountains and the artificial structured temple that was built to enclose it," end quote. Excuse me. I must admit that I took some convincing. I only have to see a map covered with lines drawn all over it to groan and close the book. But Lincoln soon had me convinced. For example, He has a diagram centered on Rennes-le-Château church, which lines with lines drawn from it to surrounding villages, churches, and castles. Straight lines ran from distant church or chateau straight through Rennes-le-Château church and out the other side to another chateau or church. One of his most convincing discoveries is of a grid pattern. When lines are drawn connecting various sites, they are found to run parallel to one another, not only from right to left, but up and down. Moreover, the lines were the same distance apart. So there are two illustrations. One is what he was talking about with Rennes-le-Château as the center, and then the lines running through it, intersecting and connecting churches and chateaus and stuff. So all roads lead to Rennes-le-Château. So that's all of that. Pause later on when this is on YouTube if you need to read all that. The other is the grid he's talking about. Let me get all them words in there. It's hard to do with a book that's not flat. I'll move it over. See all those words. That's the grid of Rennes-le-Château and environs. What is more, the unit measure on this grid is the English mile. Lincoln prints lists of distances that are in miles. For example, Rennes-le-Château to Bézieux, precisely 4 miles. Rennes-le-Château to Soulaine, precisely 4 miles. He also made a discovery that may throw a new light on Saunier's unexplained fortune. Many of his alignments went through the tower Saunier had built as his library, the Magdala Tower. The tower is placed as far to the west as Saunier could go. He built it on the edge of a sheer drop and added one more important alignment to what Lincoln calls the Rennes-le-Château Temple. There is an even more interesting piece of information. Not long before his death in 1917, Saunier had commissioned another tower, 60 meters high. We do not know where it was to be located, but Lincoln points out that one of the most important alignments of the area is the Sunrise Line, which runs from Arcs Church through Blanchefort to Rennes-le-Château. This line was the one that first got Lincoln looking for English miles. It is almost 6 miles long. If it was to be exactly 6 miles long, it would end on the slope below the Magdala Tower. But since it is on a slope below the tower, it would have to be higher than the tower if the landmarks, Blanchefort and Arcs Church, were to be seen from its summit. If this were Saunier, is this where Saunier meant to build his new tower? If so, it only underlines what we already know, that the whole area has been deliberately laid out with geometrical logic that reminds one of the streets of New York. Soon after Saunier had discovered the parchments, he spent a great deal of time rambling around surrounding hillsides, claiming he was collecting stones to build a grotto. Most commentators suspect that he was looking for treasure, but there is now a more likely possibility that on his trip to Paris he had learned the secret of geometry of the temple and was now familiarizing himself with it. Then he built the Magdala Tower, completing the sunrise alignment. He went as far as he could, but the slope of the landscape frustrated him. So it seems highly probable that 25 years later he prepared to build a second tower, 60 meters high, which would complete the sunrise line. So it sounds as if Saunier's discovery of the parchments led to his being appointed custodian of the temple, probably by Debussy, with the money to build more landmarks. What Lincoln has done with his 30-year investigation of René Le Chateau is to demonstrate the existence of some ancient science of earth measurement. Since medieval times, this science seems to have been in the custody of the Church, and we must naturally suspect the involvement of the Templars. But Lincoln is inclined to believe that it may be far older, dating back to the age of the megaliths. This immediately reminds us of Alexander Thom and his Stone Age Einsteins. Berriman seems to be making the same point in historical metrology. His argument, as noted above, is that prehistoric measurement was geodetic in origin, and that is was derived from the size of the Earth. Berriman is also, wow, completely losing it here. Pause. Berriman is full of puzzling facts, like the precise number of stayed in the Earth's circumference, and that the area of the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley is 100 square yards. He also mentions that a piece of shell was found in the Indus Valley with fine saw cuts marking a linear scale, and that the distance between two specially marked lines is precisely 2 Sumerian shusi. The shusi is 2/3 of an inch. Here is another curiosity. The Romans had a land measure called a jugerum, never heard of it, which is 5/8 of an English acre, as the French meter is 5/8 of an English mile, and it is exactly 2 square English poles. Again, we are faced with the idea that ancient measures are not dependent on the whim of some ancient king's land surveyor, but on a tradition stretching back into the dim past, and based on an exact knowledge of the size of the earth. As to this English connection, Lincoln has an amusing but fascinating speculation. Early in his investigation into René Le Chateau, he went to the Bibliothèque Nationale with Gérard Decide, and Decide suggested he should request a book called La vraie langue celtique, the true Celtic tongue. Langue? I don't know. By the Abbé Henri Boudet, priest of nearby Rennes-les-Bains, a close friend of Saunier. There is strong evidence that Boudet was Saunier's paymaster. Plantard's grandfather went to visit Boudet in 1892, and Boudet not only passed on more than 3.5 million gold francs to Saunier, or rather to Saunier's housekeeper, Marie de Nardot, but more than 7.5 million gold francs to Bishop Billard, the man who appointed Saunier, and who was obviously in on the secret. Since a gold franc was worth 35 modern francs, and there are about 9 francs to the pound sterling, Saunier received more than the equivalent of 13 million pounds, over $20 million, and his bishop more than twice that amount. Lincoln was able to obtain Baudet's book and found it baffling as well as funny. Baudet seemed to think that the original language of mankind before the Tower of Babel was English, or rather Celtic. This part of Baudet's book Lincoln describes as linguistic tomfoolery. And since Baudet was known to be an intelligent man, Lincoln suspects he has his tongue in his cheek. But the volume then turns into something far more interesting. Baudet goes on to discuss the complex megalithic structures of the area. The subtitle of the book is The Cromlech of Rennes-les-Bains. A cromlech is a megalith made up of a large flat stone resting on 2 upright stones, rather like a huge dining table. It looks as if Baudet's job was simply to hint at the mystery of the whole area and imply that it dates back to megalithic times. But Lincoln is inclined to suspect that his intention is also to tell his reader that one major key to the secret of the area lies in English, perhaps in English measures, such as the English mile, and is Boudet hinting that the original measures of mankind are English, such as the mile. Rennes-le-Château differs from other sacred sites in being centered on a natural pentacle. This would have been enough to guarantee that it would be regarded as sacred. How long has this been so? Lincoln is certain that it has been sacred for at least 1,000 years, for the temple, consisting of churches, castles, and villages, must have been designed at least 1,000 years ago. That raises an obvious question. The pentacular structure of the mountains of the area can only be seen from the air or on a good map, but we know that there were no good maps 1,000 years ago, except Portelans, which covered the sea. Land maps were crude in the extreme. But we have also seen Hapgood's evidence that there were maps, even of Antarctica before the ice, that date from thousands of years before Christianity. Now Berriman's evidence demonstrating that the Greeks stayed indicates a civilization that knew the exact size of the Earth seems to point to the Sumerians. They invented the 60-minute hour and the 60-second minute, but that raises another problem. How would the Sumerians have known the exact size of the Earth? The answer is using the method employed by the Eratosthenes in 250 BC, using the shadow of the tower in Alexandria, but it is not necessary to take two places 5,000 stayed apart. It can be done with two upright poles stuck in the ground a few miles apart. It seems clear that the ancient Egyptians knew of some such method, since they encoded the size of the earth into the measurements of the Great Pyramid. The fact that the Sumerians counted in 60s indicates that they also knew it. But if we had asked Plato where this knowledge of the size of the earth came from, he would probably have replied Atlantis, and so in all probability would Hapgood, until the last year of his life, when he became convinced that advanced levels of science dated back 100,000 years. It is true that the idea sounds totally absurd, until, that is, we recall Maurice Chatelain's argument that the Nineveh number was a factor of two even larger Kurigan numbers, and that Chatelain concluded that, quote, the Mayas and the Sumerians must have had direct connection with each other, or that they shared a common origin. Excuse me. End quote. And part of that was in italics. He says my italics. And that common origin, Chatelain suggests, was more than 60,000 years ago. Lincoln's researches on the alignment of the Rennes-le-Château area were further explored by the art historian Peter Blake, whose interest in the subject was piqued when he was looking at Luigi Signorelli's painting The Education of Pan, which was commissioned by Lorenzo de Medici. Blake suggested, where the hell did I get that? Wow. Blake noticed that the painting commissioned in 1492 contained a pentagram. Familiarity with Lincoln's analysis of the shepherds of Arcadia made its structure immediately apparent. This obviously raises the question of whether Lorenzo de Medici was also privy to the secret of the Templars and the Priory of Sion. Since he was part of the great humanist tradition, this seems highly likely. Okay, I just want to flip ahead and see how many more pages we've got here. Holy kerfuck, Batman. All right, 8 more. And if we bear in mind that he was also a patron of Leonardo, and that Leonardo is listed as a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion from 1510 to 1519, it becomes almost certain. Blake also noted that the pentagram in The Education of Pan is identical to the one Henry Lincoln found in one of the Saunier parchments found in the church of Rennes-le-Château. Poisson's The Secrets of the Shepherds of Arcadia was commissioned by Cardinal Giulio Rospigliosi, who would later become Pope Clement IX. So it seems likely that Rospigliosi was also a member of the Priory, and if that seems unbelievable for a man who became Pope, we only have to bear in mind that Pope Leo X, who made the remark, quote, "It has served us well, this myth of Christ," end quote, was Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo. Cardinal Rospigliosi also commissioned Poisson's A Dance to the Music of Time, painted in 1638. This is the last of the paintings he commissioned from Poussin, and Blake sees it in many ways as the most significant. It shows Hermes playing his lyre, or lyre, and four female figures dancing in a circle holding hands, their backs toward one another. Two sculpted heads, probably Jesus and John the Baptist, are back to back on a marble column. Across the picture on the same level is a plinth, and the line that connected them is obviously the upper line of the pentagram. Above them, Orion sweeps across the sky in his chariot. Unlike the pentagram in the Shepherds of Arcadia, this one is neatly contained within the picture. Blake has noted a color code in Shepherds in which a Jesus figure is associated with red. He goes on to argue that this also applies to a dance to the music of time. The woman to the right of the central figure is dressed in red and blue, implying both Jesus and the Virgin Mary. The central figure, a woman in a gold skirt, he associates with harvest. Blake suggests that the harvest borne by a woman is a child, which seems to be supported by a child in the right-hand corner of the picture, and that this painting hints at the notion that the woman associated with Jesus and motherhood has borne Jesus a child. There is one more painting in which he finds hints that Jesus was a father, the Deluge. This, the last of four paintings on the four seasons, and therefore representing winter, seems so odd that it almost signals hidden meaning. It shows a family struggling ashore from a stormy sea. One figure dressed in red is being pulled to shore by an ass, making the identification with Jesus fairly plain. There is a female figure dressed in gold, like the one from A Dance to the Music of Time, and she is holding a child, also dressed in red, and hinting clearly at the notion that Jesus is the Father. A snake on a rock is seen by Blake as a symbol of wisdom, like the pyramid in the background of the painting. Could all this hint at Jesus and his family arriving on a strange shore intended to represent France? It is very hard to see what this painting might otherwise represent. It was commissioned by the Duc de Richelieu, uh, uh, the nephew of Cardinal Richelieu, the minister of Louis XIII, and the Grey Eminence, I don't know why I had such trouble with that, Grey Eminence behind the throne. Richelieu became the king's first minister in 1624, and although he had been ordained a priest in Rome 17 years earlier, he took the side of the Protestants in a dispute between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Swiss Protestants, and expelled the papal troops from France. The king's mother, Marie de' Medici, was horrified and tried to persuade her son to dismiss Richelieu. But Louis was a weakling who was tired of being bullied by his mother and realized that Richelieu was his salvation. When he chose Richelieu, his mother and brother fled to the Netherlands, then occupied by Spain. Now Richelieu held Poussin in the highest esteem, so much so that he exerted pressure to make Poussin return from his beloved Italy to become a member of the Royal Academy of Painting. Poussin went much against his will in 1640 and was relieved to be allowed to return to Italy 2 years later. It is probable that he became a member of the Priory of Sion while he was in Paris, and on his return to Italy embarked on the commissions for Cardinal Rospigliosi. Richelieu continued to visit Poussin in Italy. This, of course, raises the suggestion that Richelieu was himself a member of the Priory of Sion, and this explains why he was on the side of the Protestants rather than the Catholic Church. In which case, was it Richelieu who inducted Poussin into the Priory? If Richelieu was indeed a member of the Priory, then he obviously did not share its desire to restore the Merovingians to the throne, for he is generally believed to have been behind making sure that Anne of Austria became pregnant, and so kept the descendants of Pepin the Short on the throne. Why should that be so? Presumably because it made no real difference to Richelieu whether a Merovingian or a Carolingian was on the throne. The House of Lorraine was no more likely to tell the world the truth about Christianity than the House of Bourbon, to which Louis belonged, was. And that the House of Lorraine with the House of Lorraine on the throne, Richelieu would lose his power. So he helped to preserve the House of Bourbon by ensuring that it had an heir. But if Richelieu was indeed a member of the Priory, it merely underlines the astonishing fact that so many of the most remarkable men of their time regarded the popes and princes of the Church as a dynasty of impostors, and would have been glad to see the end of Roman Catholicism. When Peter Blake had worked out the pentagrams in Poussin's The Shepherds of Arcadia and A Dance to the Music of Time, and in Signorelli's Education of Pan, he tried applying them to the landscape around Rennes-le-Château and was delighted to find that they fit. The pentagram from Signorelli fit neatly onto a number of hilltops, and so did the pentagram from The Shepherds of Arcadia. As to the pentagram from A Dance to the Music of Time, Blake turned it at an angle of 90 degrees to the other two, since it was a female-dominated painting, and again found that its vertices rested on hilltops, and the intersection of the pentagrams fell on a hill at the end of the valley. Nearby was a rocky spur on a hilltop called Estagnol, which in Old French translates as the Lamb of the East. Blake drove to the spot and found it to be a finger of stone at the top of an escarpment, with a 10-meter drop on its far side. He could see a massive stone slab lying at the bottom, leaning against a cliff face. There was a hole full of moss on one side of the slab. Blake tore this out and opened up a meter-square gap. Inside he found a cavity with a flat earth floor. He crawled through a triangular cave, noticing that underneath the earth on its floor there was a bed of flat stones. He pulled one of these out and saw that it was rough and irregular underneath. This floor had obviously been carefully laid. Interesting. At the far end of the cave, there was an opening which led out into the daylight. A few yards further along, he found another stone slab leaning against a triangular opening, and inside it yet another cave. These two caves, Blake believes, are the tombs of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Let me try to summarize this extremely complex story. According to Lomas and Knight, Freemasonry is a tradition of knowledge that extends back to the flood of 7600 BC. This was caused by the impact of a large body from space which broke into 7 burning mountains, as reported by the prophet Enoch. Around 1530 BC, the pharaoh Sequenenre was killed by 3 employees of the Hyksos rival pharaoh Apopi, who wanted to force him to divulge the ritual for transforming the pharaoh into a god. They failed, and the new pharaoh, Sequenenre's son, led a revolt that drove the Hyksos out of Egypt in 1522 BC. His father's killer was probably a Hebrew, but by 6 centuries later the story had been altered, and Hiram Abif, the Tyrian architect of Solomon's temple, had become the victim. Solomon had been tempted from the religion of Yahweh by some of his Phoenician wives and made sacrifices to the goddess Astarte, one of the names of Venus. His temple was built on the lines of a temple to Astarte. In 587 BC, the Jews were dragged off into their Babylonian captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar and were not allowed to return until 50 years later. In exile, they had dreamed of a Messiah, an anointed one, who would lead them to victory and establish the kingdom of God on earth. They hoped that Zerubbabel, who built the temple, would declare himself the Messiah, but he had no ambitions in this direction. And just as a side note, never mind, I withdraw the side note. When Alexander the Great became their ruler, many hoped that he was the Messiah. But when one of the Seleucids, Alexander's successors, set up a statue of Zeus in the temple, it led to the revolt of Judas Maccabeus, whose family became the hereditary priesthood. This led a disgusted group of religious conservatives called Essenes to move into the wilderness of Qumran, where they lived ascetic lives. Their leader was called the Teacher of Righteousness, and he worked miracles, claimed to be the Messiah, and was executed about a century before the coming of Jesus. The similarities between this teacher and Jesus are so great that the scholar G.R.S. Mead wrote a book called Did Jesus Live 100 BC? Interesting, I might have to look that book up. Jesus himself was the eldest of a family of 4 brothers and 2 or more sisters. His father, Joseph, was a Pharisee, one of those Jews who insist on strict observance of the law. Jesus would turn his back on this sect, feeling it to be barren. His second cousin, John the Baptist, was the son of a priest named Zechariah, who was of the Abijah sect. Abijah was a descendant of Aaron. At a fairly early age, John went into the wilderness. Since his parents were old when he was born, it seems likely he was orphaned early, and since the Essenes took in orphans, they lived in chastity, so had no other way of sustaining their numbers. It is likely that the wilderness means Qumran. The presence of his cousin among the Essenes may also explain why Jesus and his younger brother James became attached to the sect. Jesus was crucified because he was intent on leading a rebellion that would drive the Romans out of Judea. King Herod was not only a friend of Rome, he also had a group of rich Jewish admirers known as the Herodians, who were perfectly happy with the Roman occupation. So Jesus was playing a dangerous game, with enemies on both sides. When the uprising he hoped to lead failed to materialize, Jesus was condemned and crucified. However, crucifixion was not quite the agonizing ordeal most of us suppose. Except for those condemned for the worst kinds of treason, it did not involve being nailed to a cross, but tied with ropes around the wrists and ankles. Moreover, a man sentenced to crucifixion was usually left on the cross for days until he was dead. Jesus was left for only 6 hours, because it was Passover the next day, a Sabbath, and the law did not allow men to remain on the cross over Passover. Then a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, The Jewish council went to Pilate and obtained permission to take down the body of Jesus, whose death had deeply impressed him, and put it in his own tomb, which was nearby. Jesus was conveyed to a tomb, but Joseph of Arimathea was to suffer several years' imprisonment for his own support. According to another New Testament scholar, Barbara Thiering, in Jesus the Man, Jesus was then revived with an antidote to the poison he had been given on a sponge. What then happened, if Lincoln, Bejant, and Lay are correct, is that Jesus was taken across the Mediterranean, probably to Marseille, and there continued his ministry. According to Barbara Thiering, he made a final journey to Rome, where he died sometime after AD 64, when he would be 71. This, then, was why the tradition that Jesus had died on the cross was never accepted in the region of Areda, which became Rennes-le-Château, where he spent much of his later life. Why, in that case, is there not a strong tradition regarding Jesus, as well as of Mary Magdalene, in the south of France? Perhaps because King Herod was also exiled to Gaul by Caligula, where he died in AD 69. It would not be good sense for a fugitive from the law to attract too much attention. Peter Blake, as we have seen, believes he has found the tombs of Jesus and Mary Magdalene side by side, and that this location is coded into Poisson's paintings. This, then, is probably the knowledge, quote, that kings would have great difficulty in obtaining from him, end quote, particularly Louis XIV, who belonged to the wrong dynasty. The next question concerns the Merovingian dynasty. When Henry Lincoln set out to research them, he found that details were lacking due to the assiduity of the church in censoring the records. But we know that it was found by a Frankish king named Merovech, or Morave, who was crowned in AD 448, so he would be a contemporary of King Arthur. His kingdom would have extended over most of France, from Marseille in the south to the Ardennes in the north. This seems to be the person whose legendary origin gave Henry Lincoln and Richard Lay the insight that led to the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, that the fish that impregnated Merovech's mother might symbolize the founder of Christianity, as it did in early days. Lincoln cites a tradition that Merovingian monarchs were occult adepts and that they were often called the sorcerer kings. This would certainly explain why they found such significance in Rennes-le-Château area with its natural pentagram of hills. We're getting there. Lincoln mentions that the tomb of Merovech's son, Childrich I, was found in the Ardennes in 1653 and contained great treasures, including various objects obviously associated with sorcery, a crystal ball, a severed horse's head, and a golden bull's head. There were also 300 bees made of gold. Oddly enough, Napoleon insisted on these bees being attached to his coronation robes, and his interest in the Merovingians also indicated by the fact that he commissioned a genealogy of the dynasty. The genealogy was later used in the documents deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale. The myths surrounding the Merovingians included the notion that they originated in Arcadia in Greece, presumably explaining the inscription on the tomb in the Shepherds of Arcadia. And so, in due course, the descendant of the Merovingians, Godfrey of Bouillon, led the First Crusade, and after his death, his brother Baldwin I gave the members of the priory permission to move into the stables. We presume they found there what they were looking for. The scrolls of the Essenes had been allowed to the scrolls the Essenes had been allowed to conceal in the temple, including the heavenly Jerusalem scroll with its Masonic symbols. These were transported back to France and may have been stored in the Chateau of Bezou in the midst of Cathar country. Lincoln mentions that St. Bernard, who had traveled to the area intending to preach against the Cathars, was less appalled by the heretics than by the corruption of his own church, and praised the purity of their morals. When the Templars were arrested by Philip the Fair, their fleet escaped with the scrolls, which ended at Roslin, but the priory under Edouard, Comte de Bar, continued its secret existence. Freemasonry finally came into the open in 1640. This was preceded by the strange affair of the Rosicrucians. In 1614, the publication of a pamphlet called Fama Fraternitatis, or Fraternal Declaration, which I think I might have, of the Meritorious Order of the Rosy Cross, caused a sensation all over Europe. It purports to describe the life of a mystic magician of the 15th century named Christian Rosenkreutz, who lived to be 106 and whose body was preserved undecayed in a mysterious tomb for the next 120 years. The pamphlet goes on to invite all interested parties to join the Brotherhood and tells them that they only have to make their interest known by word of mouth or in writing, and they will be contacted. Hundreds of people published their willingness to join, but as far as known, no one ever received a reply. The Fama was followed by two more Rosicrucian works, the Confessio, 1615, and a larger work called the Chemical Wedding, 1616. I know I've got the Chemical Wedding. Confessio, I'm not sure. These These intensified the Rosicrucian fever. The author is believed to be a Protestant theologian named Johann Valentin André, who is most certainly the author of the Chemical Wedding. Although he denied writing the other two, he seems to have started as an idealistic young man who hoped to launch a new spiritual movement since, like so many other people at that period, he felt that it was time for a new beginning. And significantly, he is listed in the secret dossier as one of the Grand Masters of the Priory of Sion. Finally, in Scotland and in England, an organization that called itself the Freemasons came into being around 1640. The Catholic Church hated it, but in the early days, particularly in Scotland, there seemed to have been as many Catholics as Protestants in the organization. The full implications were not understood until after the Second World War, when the Priory of Sion under Pierre Plantard decided that it was time to go public, and secured its greatest publicity coup when Henry Lincoln found Gerard de Cide's book and persuaded the BBC to make a documentary. The book that eventually resulted, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, became an international bestseller. Yet it still only reached a cultured minority prepared to immerse themselves in the history of the Merovingians. Then, in 2003, Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, which included an account of the story of the Priory of Sion, reached the largest audience so far and brought the history of Jesus and the Templars to millions of readers. It is probably the most widely read attack on Catholicism since Martin Luther, but Brown evidently decided that including Saunier and René Le Chateau would complicate the story too much, and Saunier's name is kept only for the curator of the Louvre, who is murdered in the first few pages. And that, at the time of writing, is the latest episode in this strange story that is the history of Christianity. That is the end of the chapter. So a hint at the title of the book. And now the next chapter is called Primal Vision. And I see in the very first paragraph a reference to the Cro-Magnon, or Cro-Magnon if you prefer, but I learned it as Cro-Magnon because they were discovered in France, and that would be more close That would be closer to the French pronunciation of the word. All right, so looks like the next one's going to be a pretty long chapter too. 26 pages. And then we have our final chapter titled The Old Ones, where hopefully he ties it all together and talks about the Neanderthals a little bit. But if not, oh, there's also an appendix. Atlantis in Cyprus, which is another 8 or 10 pages. So, all right. So we'll have to get through all that. But that is the end of that. And how long did it take us? Almost 2 hours again. So that will end this reading session, and I will come back in a little bit to do at least a short gaming session of Dead Island, because it's actually Saturday, not Sunday, so I should have been just playing Dead Island tonight. Anyway, that'll be it. I'll see you in a little bit.
Prepare to die. Prepare to die. Welcome to a whole new world. Your planet is now under Mid-Ranger's control. Humanity will be exterminated. If you hear this message, do not try to leave. Do not try to fight. Do not try to resist. You will be eliminated. You will be eliminated. Prepare to die. Rangers control, humanity will be exterminated. If you hear this message, do not try to leave. Do not try to fight. Do not try to resist. You will be eliminated. Prepare to die. Prepare to die. Welcome to a whole new world. Your planet is now under Mid-Ranger's control. Humanity will be exterminated. If you hear this message, do not try to leave. Do not try to fight. Do not try to resist. You will be eliminated. You will be eliminated. Prepare to die. message. Do not try to leave. Do not try to fight. Do not try to resist. You will be eliminated. You will be eliminated. Prepare to die.